Okay, I think this is up and our waiting room guests have been let in. So it is 1 o'clock now. We're gonna go ahead and get started today. So let's see, this is our actual sixth session of the entire series. We have two more to go before the end of the year. So thank you for sticking around and thank you for joining us today. So we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. So this session today is all about reproduction. It may be a little heavy hitting at times, but just stick with me. Some of these topics are just a little bit more vast and have some pretty big terms attached to them, but I'll walk you through it. So throughout this series, I've had a lot of great help. These are some of my colleagues and subject matter experts that have jumped on to assist. If you missed their sessions, they are actually all recorded and posted onto YouTube, and I will email the links out after every session so you can go back and watch those. And just bear with me because I don't have any help today to run my PowerPoint slides or answer questions in the comments. So if you have any questions, just unmute yourself and ask. But if you haven't joined us on one of our webinar series, we're just going to kind of go through some housekeeping, then we'll jump right in. So our goals of the webinar series is just basically give an introduction of the dairy industry and its parts and pieces, mainly in Missouri, but across the nation as well. I know we have some out-of-state guests and also some out-of-country guests, so it's been very nice to have here. Another thing that we want to accomplish is just explore how to best manage a smaller herd, and we're going to break it down in sections or like a step-by-step approach throughout our series. And then finally, just be informative no matter if you're a seasoned pro in the dairy world or if you're just beginning. I want this to be applicable to everybody, and hopefully everybody will find something new or something that they haven't heard before. Okay, so if you haven't used Zoom before, welcome. But to ask a question, you are more than welcome to type it out in the chat box. If you look along the bottom bar of your screen, there's going to be a chat button. Just click on it, type it in, and send it straight to me. And if you have a question that may be a little bit more in depth, maybe we need to have a one-on-one conversation, feel free to email that to me. My email is down at the bottom of this slide, and it will be at the last slide as well. So a little bit about me, if you haven't been on a session before. Hello, my name is Chloe. I am your regional dairy field specialist in the Southwest region of Missouri. So my responsibilities include educating dairy producers, whether it's like a face-to-face program, a classroom program, educational articles, and then on-farm visits or a Zoom webinar like we're doing today. So besides just the educational portion, I play a lot of different roles, wear a lot of different hats within New Extension, from serving on soil and water boards to even our local fair boards. So my background is actually in cattle reproduction. So this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. My master's work was in cattle reproduction with a focus in endocrinology. So you guys are in for a treat. Okay, so kind of some questions to open up the floor for today. What is your experience with dairying and where are you looking to go within the dairy industry? And have you ever used artificial insemination before? So you're free to type those in the chat box, unmute, whatever you would like to do. Okay. So you're free to just send your answers to those questions in, but we're going to keep rolling. We have quite a bit to cover today. So kind of to get started, we're just going to take this from ground floor up. So I'd like to call this Dairy Reproduction 101. So back to the basics. There's no better place to start than the basics. But it may seem simple, but there's only two reproductive categories that a female can fall into. Either one, she's bred, or two, she is not bred. So pretty easy to decipher. Either she's carrying a calf or she is not. And there's only two ways for her to become bred, either natural service with a bull or artificial insemination, which we'll talk some more about. Okay, so kind of the age-old question is, why is she not bred? What happened? She should be bred. You hear that a lot with conversations with producers. But there's many factors that can impact that why isn't she bred or why isn't this working? So external and internal functions that can prevent a successful pregnancy. We'll talk about a couple of them. We're going to talk a little bit briefly, but you can really dive deep into the weeds on a couple of these. And they kind of fall into different categories from anatomical malfunctions, physiology, endocrine, and even some of those external factors like disease can all prevent her from getting pregnant and staying pregnant. So whenever I have a producer kind of talk to me and they're like, hey, we're having this issue, one of my questions to them is, what are you feeding them? What does their plane of nutrition look like? So as we know, nutrition is kind of the basis of everything. If there's no good food there for her to eat, no good energy, she's going to really struggle. So I love this picture, and it is an older picture, but they figured it out right the first time. So if we look here on the right, it's going to say gross energy. So that is what she is actively eating and putting into her body. So 100% of that energy is going into the cow. But where does it go when it gets to the cow? So you can kind of see all these circles around it. This is how energy partitions off after she has consumed it. So we're automatically going to lose a giant percentage just to fecal energy, heat energy, and gas energy. So her breathing, her sweating, and then of course excrements. So if we look at that, that's over 50% of what she's consumed already being lost. So once that is lost, she only has a couple more percentages of energy to work with. So where that is going to go first, after all of her energy loss, is just going to maintain her. So the energy that she needs to breathe, keep her heart beating, keep those lungs moving, keep her stomach functions going on, that takes up 20% of what's left. Once that 20% is taken, we only have 20% to work with out of our starting 100. And that 20% goes to just production of milk, then it goes to reproduction, then it goes to growth. So she doesn't have much to work with. So if she's not getting really good quality feed up front, this schematic becomes a lot harder to maintain. So it's one of the biggest limiting factors in reproduction is nutrition. And of course, this can go very much in depth. If you have any questions on it, feel free to send me an email and we can talk all day long. So what else impacts reproductive success? So we talked about nutrition, but we can also talk about labor. So how much on-farm help you have, just the overall health of your cattle, the environment. Is it raining? Is it snowing while she's trying to get pregnant? What are your facilities like? Does she have a nice dry place to go and have that calf? And then just overall management. How close are you paying attention to your reproductive program? So you can kind of look at these in two ways. These are either going to limit what she can do, or these can help her be more successful in getting bred. Great. So let's kind of talk about standards. What are we aiming for within cattle reproduction? So when we think about our ladies, they are essentially our employees of the farm. Their whole job is to, one, get bred, and then two, produce milk. Because without that production of milk, you have no profit, therefore you have no dairy. So a heifer, so a cow, a female that has not had a calf yet, she should have her first calf at 2 years of age and then should keep producing a calf every 365 days. But for her to be able to breed at 14 months of age, she has to at least reach that 60 to 65% of that mature weight. So again, that kind of rolls back into our nutrition that we talked about. If she's not getting adequately fed, she's not growing, there's no way that she's going to be able to turn around and start producing a calf. So we'll talk about nutrition a lot. It is really just kind of the basis of everything. But we're going to hang on tight. We're going to go ahead and kind of deep dive into the parts and pieces of how reproduction works. Some of this kind of can get into the weeds, but we're going to go from a very base level introduction part. So when we talk about anatomy and physiology, these are two terms that interchange some, but they mean totally different things. So anatomy is actually the field of biology that studies the structure of the organisms and their parts, while physiology studies the function. So anatomy is how it looks, physiology is what it does. So just our basic anatomy that we need to know to be successful in cattle reproduction. So we'll kind of start at the top of this picture. Of course, we have our rectum, which lies above the reproductive tract if we're looking at the cow. Then under that, we'll kind of work from the left to right. So on the left, we have our labia, which is the most external portion of her reproductive tract. So what that does is kind of make that door between the environment and her tract opening. So, and then after our labia, we will move into the vagina. Sometimes this gets a little bit confusing for people because they're like, oh, it's just cow vagina. But we actually have a labia or a vulva in between that. So the vagina is mostly talked about in natural cervix because that's where a bull will deposit semen. If we're talking about artificial insemination, that is kind of just a pass through for us. So when we talk about artificial insemination, we're kind of moving down the line and we get to the cervix, which is in green here. So our cervix is mainly functioning as a barrier between the outside environment and the uterus. So when she is bred, that cervix will fully close and kind of be just a brick wall, essentially, to protect that fetus. So that is when we talk about artificial insemination, the hardest portion of the tract to find, progress through, and I'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. But after we go past our cervix, so we get into the uterine body and then the uterine horn, which is in blue. Some people do kind of connect those terms, but if we're looking at the actual structure of it, they are vastly different. So after we go uterine body, uterine horns, we go into this little pink squiggle, which is our oviduct, and then our oviduct connects to our ovary. So that is it for her entire reproductive tract. Not too terribly, it's not too terribly hard to understand, but it does help seeing it in a picture form and seeing exactly where everything is and what connects to what. Okay. So a little bit more into the weeds here. I do like to bring up the suspensory ligament because it is a good portion of our reproductive tract and really is the support for it. So you may hear this interchange with broad ligament, suspensory ligament, same thing. So all this is tissue that kind of suspends that reproductive tract from the body walls. It holds it up in the middle, kind of like a big curtain, if you will. But this is where all the pass-throughs are for your vascular system, your lymphatic system, and you can kind of see it on this right-hand side of the picture. All those lines there is going to grab on and hold that reproductive tract up. So it's not just floating around willy-nilly in the body, it's actually stable. So the broad ligament is made up of 3 different parts. You can see they all start with meso, meaning middle, so kind of that middle of the body area. But you have the mesometrium, which is the body of the broad ligament, the mesophalanx, which is the oviduct portion, and then finally the mesovarium, which connects to the ovary. So again, kind of in the weeds, but just parts and pieces that we need to know about. Okay. And then if we look at layers of the reproductive tract, so this spans, of course, from the vagina all the way through the uterine horns, this is what it is comprised of. So there's 4 layers to our reproductive tract. We have the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa, and those are working from inside out. So if we think about the muscularis, this is going to be our muscle layer. So these really help when those contractions start. That's what the muscularis is doing. And then the middle of our tract is called the lumen, which is just meaning hollow or cavity, since it is open. Okay. And then continuing on, does anybody have any questions before we jump into the ovary? Anything about the reproductive tract, how it's made up, any of the parts and pieces, or are we all doing good? I know it can be a lot to kind of cover at first. Okay. So we're going to keep moving along. So now we're going to talk more about the ovary itself. So if we take a look back at that big picture that we just looked at, the ovary is this little red blob here, but just remember she has 2, so 1 on each side, each connects to a separate uterine horn. So we have two ovaries. Every cow, in theory, should have two ovaries unless she is just a little bit special and has a hidden one tucked in there, but usually always two. So when we're looking at our ovary, we're going to talk about the follicle development in a counterclockwise pattern. So the follicles in an ovary, she's going to be born with however many follicles she's going to have. These do not generate like semen does in a male. So what she has is what she's going to get. There's no way to make more. And these follicles will essentially become the oocyte that she ovulates, which becomes the embryo, which becomes the fetus. So all these little follicles are just hanging out in the ovary, waiting to mature and then potentially become a calf. So starting on our top left-hand side, we're going to first talk about the primordial follicle. So of course, she has all the primordial follicles that she's ever going to have at birth. These are the most immature stage of our follicle, and they actually decrease in number as the female matures. So why is that? Why are they decreasing? Because she is eventually going to kind of collate or grab up these follicles in preparation for ovulation. So once we have our primordials, they are going to mature a little bit more and they are going to become primary follicles. Most of these are never going to actually ovulate and will die off. So think of the follicles kind of, it's a funny thing to think about, but this is how I remember it. I think of all our follicles kind of as like sorority girls going to college and trying to get into the sorority. They have a big, huge recruitment party, but not all of them are going to make it. Not all of them are going to be head of their sorority. So all these little primary follicles will get together. The cow will actually recruit them when it comes time for ovulation, but not all of them will make it. So think of this as like all the big sorority girls going to their first recruitment stage. So after our primary follicles, we're going to have our secondary follicles. So this is kind of like that second round pick, if you will. So they will start increasing in cellular layers. So we can kind of see two different cell layers there, and that's their theca interna and externa. So again, you don't have to remember these big terms, but I'm just going to try to tell you the basics of everything. And of course, if you have questions, just stop me, tell me to slow down, or you can always send me an email and we can talk about it more. But it is important to know just to see kind of how everything works. So after our secondary follicles, we have our tertiary follicles. So this next term, antrum, all that is a fluid pocket in the middle of that follicle. So as they progress, as they mature, they're going to increase in cell layers, so that outside ring, and then as well as that antrum in the middle. So the more fluid that is filling that follicle, the more pressure there is, the more it's going to grow. And then we go to our Graafian follicle or our dominant follicle. So these are the ones that are going to be capable of ovulation. This is like the sorority girls that are made it, they're in the sorority, and now they're all competing to be the head of their sorority, if you will. So we have a lot more buildup of fluid inside. That thing is growing, pressure is building, and then they will ovulate. So our dominant follicle is going to ovulate. Here is our little ovulated oocyte down at the bottom right. And then once that happens, ovulation has occurred. She's going to go into what we call standing heat. And then that follicle rupturing site will turn into a corpus hemorrhagicum or a CH. Some people will also call this a bloody body. So if you've heard that term, same thing. So that will eventually heal over and kind of turn into this yellow lump here on the right-hand side. And if you ever get a chance to see an ovary or dissect one, you will actually see like the little yellow lumps on them. So if you remember anything at all from this slide, I want you to remember the corpus luteum or your CL. So our corpus luteum is super important because it actually starts producing progesterone, which is the hormone that maintains pregnancy. So without the formation of this guy on the ovary after ovulation, then we won't have a successful pregnancy. And then once the CL starts to progress, it turns into a corpus albicans or a CA. And all that is just like a little piece of scar tissue on an ovary. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about different follicles, different types? Again, you're more than welcome to go back and re-listen to this. It's going to be recorded and posted. So if it kind of seems a little bit crazy the first time, don't worry, you can go and watch it again. And of course, just reach out if you have any questions. Okay. So after we know about, now we know the anatomy, we know the physiology, we know what the pieces are and what they're doing, we can kind of talk a little bit more about endocrinology. So endocrinology is just the study of endocrine glands and their hormones. But without these hormones, without these endocrine glands, the whole entire reproductive process is not going to work. So her heat cycles, they're all controlled by these hormones. So when we think about the regulation of heat cycles and endocrinology as a whole, it really is a whole body function. It's not just occurring in her reproductive tract, it occurs in the brain, it occurs at the kidneys, and it also occurs, of course, in the reproductive tract and the attachment to that fetus. So we'll talk about a couple different things within endocrinology. I'll try not to bore you to death or overwhelm you too bad, so just hang on tight. But let's talk about kind of locations of terms. So when I talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, both of these are going to be located in the brain. And then we talk about the ovary. Of course, we learned that those are attached to the uterine horns, as well as the placenta is going to be attached inside the uterine body. So this is kind of just where everything is at when we start talking about these hormones. Okay. Is everybody still hanging in so far? Any questions? Of course, you can put them in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself and talk if you have anything that needs clarification. All right, guys, we'll keep on moving. Okay, so when we're thinking about hormones communicating from all over the body, there has to be a way that they do that, and they have to be good at doing that. Otherwise, our heat cycles won't happen, and everything's going to be messed up. So how do hormones communicate with one another in the target tissues? So if we look on the left here, our little shape is, oh, sorry, y'all. This little shape is going to function as our hormone. So as that hormone is sent all over the body, it's kind of looking for a place to go to talk. So another way that I think of this is kind of the lady at the switchboard. She is taking those hormones, plugging them in, and once they're plugged in, they're able to communicate back and forth. So if we look in the middle of this picture, this would be a cell of a target tissue that that hormone is trying to talk to, but it has to bind first. So what affects the strength of that communication is receptor density. So how many of these binding sites are there for that hormone to latch onto? And then how long are they staying there? So that length of binding time. So the longer they stay there and the more communication they have, the more successful they're going to be. So think about just those two things. How much hormone can bind? How long can it stay there and chit chat? Okay. So again, I am trying to keep this very brief for you guys and very base level, but this is all super important when we start thinking about our artificial insemination protocols and what you're going to need to get in order to carry out those protocols. So our first hormone that we will talk about is called GnRH, or our gonadotropin releasing hormone. So if we remember back to our big picture of the cow and I was showing you where everything is for hormones, this hormone, our GnRH, is going to come from the hypothalamus. So if we look in our picture here, we have our hypothalamic neurons, so that connect to the hypothalamus. And then this hormone is going to target the anterior pituitary. So it's going to come from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary, and that's all it has to do. So what is its purpose? GnRH stimulates the release of LH and FSH, which I will tell you all about in just a minute. But if you're ever planning your protocols for artificial insemination, what you're usually going to ask your vet for, or the trade name of this hormone, is called cysterellin. Okay. So we just brought this term up. So FSH is called follicle stimulating hormone. So this one, it comes from the anterior pituitary, and it's going to target our ovary. So the granulosa cells in that little follicle. So what does it do? FSH stimulates follicular development. So remember our sorority recruitment, FSH kind of gets that started. It also helps with estrogen production. So as we increase the number of follicles, they're going to increase how much estrogen they're producing. So again, the trade name for this one is pholotropin. So let's kind of take a pause and recap what we now know. So GnRH comes from the hypothalamus and affects the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary starts making FSH, which targets the ovaries. So, right. Up next, we have LH, or our luteinizing hormone. So again, this is one that is affected by our GnRH. So the LH comes from the anterior pituitary and again to the ovary. This one actually targets specifically the thecal and luteal cells. So what LH does is it actually stimulates ovulation. So it makes that follicle rupture and that oocyte goes out. And then it starts beginning the formation of our CL, remember our corpus luteum, which starts progesterone secretion. So now that we know these three, we can think back about GnRH comes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Once that anterior pituitary is stimulated, it's going to release our FSH and LH to go to the ovary. So clear as mud, right? It gets easier, I promise. Okay, so estrogen, this should all sound very familiar to you guys. This is one of two of the most important hormones within our estrous cycle, within our cows. So estrogen is going to come from those granulosa cells in the ovary, and it's actually going to go back to the hypothalamus, the pituitary, just the brain in general, as well as the entire reproductive tract. So we're sending LH, we're sending FSH to the ovary. The ovary is going to start estrogen production. And then when there's enough estrogen, it's going to make it all the way back to the brain. So kind of to really get into the weeds with you guys, but this is all going to function kind of like a big circular tract. So the FSH coming out, the LH coming out is affecting the ovary. Once the ovary is affected, it's going to produce estrogen and send it back to the brain saying, okay, we have enough. And then LH and FSH production will shut down. So again, just functions kind of like a big circular motion. So kind of like electricity, if you will. It's all going to be in a circuit. If you have enough, it's going to shut off. If you don't have enough, it's going to turn back on production. So what estrogen does, again, it's going to regulate all these hormones that we just talked about coming from the brain. It's going to increase secretions within the reproductive tract, which therefore looks like estrous behavior. So if you see any mounting in your herd, standing heat, that is all caused by estrus. Okay, so the second most important hormone is progesterone. So if we think back to that yellow thing on the ovary, which was our CL, or our corpus luteum, that is where our progesterone hormone comes from. So here's a picture of a CL on an ovary, and then where this hormone goes, it is targeting the endometrium and the myometrium, which are tissues inside that uterus. It's going to target the hypothalamus, remember in our brain, and it's also going to target the mammary glands. So why in the world would progesterone go to the mammary glands if the purpose is to maintain a pregnancy? Well, if that cow is pregnant, she's going to have to eventually feed that baby. So progesterone is saying, hey, mammary tissues start growing, we're going to have a baby to feed soon. And then within the uterus, it's just saying, hey, we are still pregnant. We're going to keep this pregnancy good and going. And then another thing why it goes back to the brain is again that big circuit that we talked about. We don't want any more ovulation occurring while she's trying to maintain that pregnancy. So whenever you're planning your artificial insemination protocols, progesterone is going to show up in those as a CEDAR. So this is essentially synthetic progesterone. Okay, so again, clear as mud. I know it's kind of heavy-hitting topics, but these hormones are all important to know what they do in order to be successful at executing your artificial insemination protocols or just understanding where a cow is at any point in time during her heat cycle. And then we will put this all together in a graph, and hopefully that will just make it a little bit easier to see and kind of understand. So just hang tight, we're almost there. Okay, so another hormone that this one can kind of get confused when we start talking about progesterone versus prostaglandin, but they are essentially the opposite of each other. So prostaglandin, or if you ever hear of it by its trade name, luteinized prostamate or estromate, this one is going to come from the uterine endometrium. So remember those layers in the uterus, and its target is going to be the CL. So what this does is causes luteolysis. So luteolysis is just death or regression of that CL on the ovary. So prostaglandin will get rid of essentially progesterone. So this can be important to know about because if you were to give prostaglandin to a pregnant animal, it will cause her to abort. So very important that you remember the difference and then make sure if you were ever handling this, wear gloves because these are hormones that can affect any type of reproduction, whether it's female, and it can also have effects on males as well because prostaglandin essentially causes smooth muscle contractions. So if you get a little bit of an upset tummy after handling prostaglandin, that's why. So just keep in mind, be cautious when you're handling these hormones. And always, if you're uncomfortable, have a vet present to help you out. Okay, so another probably familiar one to a couple of you guys, we have oxytocin. So again, we're thinking back to the brain, oxytocin is going to come from the posterior pituitary. So again, that pituitary glands in the brain. Its target, again, is going to be our uterine tissues, so our endometrium and our myometrium, as well as those mammary glands. So a lot of people think of oxytocin as the milk letdown hormone, which you're not incorrect, but it also has a couple more functions. So oxytocin is another one that can stimulate those muscle contractions within smooth muscle, and it is, for the trade name, just called oxytocin. So if you've ever heard of a cow not cleaning out her placenta after giving birth, your vet may recommend a shot of oxytocin in order to start those contractions to expel the rest of that placenta. So this one is less dangerous than the prostaglandin, but still can be harmful if given to a still-bred cow. Okay. All right, I think this is our last hormone to cover. You guys have almost made it. This one is pretty easy, so not too terrible. So prolactin, another one that affects milk production. This comes from the anterior pituitary and solely targets those mammary glands. So this one is going to come into play whenever that calf is on the ground and kind of nudging at her or bawling. The prolactin will be released, and it does stimulate milk production. Okay, you guys have made it. Do we have any questions about the hormones that we just covered? I know it's a lot, I know it's complicated, but just kind of knowing what they are, recognizing those words can be super helpful. So again, if you have questions, just drop them in the chat box. Feel free to unmute. Otherwise, I will just keep trucking. Okay. So now that we've heard all the terms, we've learned all the things, let's put it together and talk about it as a whole. So I love this graph because I'm a very visual learner, so kind of seeing everything in picture form really helps me out. So let's start on our right-hand side. Look inside this blue box and we'll see all of those follicle types that we talked about on that big ovary picture. So again, think of these as our sorority girls, and they're going to go through recruitment. So again, these primordials, so the itsy bitsy ones at the top of this list, those are all the immature follicles. So she's going to have as many of those as what she has at birth to last her whole entire life. Then we go into primary, then tertiary, then our mature follicle. And then atresic is going to be these yellow ones, so the ones that don't make it and die off. And then finally, this big red follicle is going to be the one that ovulates. So let's check out our graph over here. So this graph represents a single heat cycle. So day 0 to day about 20 is when she's going to go through her heat cycle. She's going to ovulate at the end of it on this graph. So through our heat cycle in our cow, we're going to have 3 stages of follicle recruitment. So if we check this out at day 0, we're going to have all of our primordial follicles. Recruitment's going to start, they're all going to show up, and only a few of them are going to make it to our next stage and become primary follicles. So we have some more recruitment. We only have even less this time make it into being tertiaries, and then they're going to slowly die off. So that's kind of our first follicular wave. So still within the same heat cycle, a couple days later, she'll start a new recruitment period of those follicles. So again, we have our primordials. They're going to grow up a little bit, become primaries. Recruitment's going to happen again. Not all of them are going to make it. And then we eventually are going to get to a mature follicle. And you would think that would be our winner, but nope, it's going to die off as well. So finally, a couple days later, still in her same heat cycle, we're going to have another stage of recruitment. So on this third stage of recruitment, again, we have our primordials show up, all of our sorority girls. They're going to go through selection. We're going to get to that mature follicle stage again, and that one is the winner. That's our head sorority girl. So it's going to go ahead and ovulate, and then it is ready to meet up with sperm and create an embryo. Okay, so does this kind of help kind of putting together all of our follicular waves and kind of seeing how those progress in terms to ovulation? Okay, so that's just part of our graph. We're going to talk about all of those colorful lines next. So as you can see, these lines are going to vary throughout our heat cycle. So taking a look at the bottom, we'll start with our first line of progesterone first. So if we start at day 0, this would be ovulation of the previous heat cycle. Once that follicle ovulates, remember it's going to regress and heal over and create that CL. So our CL creation starts about right here after day 0. Once that CL is formed, it's going to start secreting progesterone. So our progesterone secretion is going to go up, is going to level out, then eventually it's going to regress and drop off. So remember, this regression is because it turns into a corpus albicans, that little scar tissue, it heals over, and it's no more. So once we don't have our CL anymore, we don't have any more progesterone, and then the whole entire cycle starts back over again. Okay, so next up, let's think about our FSH. So if we remember, that's our follicle stimulating hormone, and it does exactly what its name is. So it's going to stimulate all of those follicles in waves to cause those literally follicular waves. So you can see on day 0, it's going to increase, our follicle recruitment is going to occur, and then it's going to decrease and those follicles are going to die back off. It's going to increase again, we'll have another follicular wave, and then it's going to digress again. And finally, we're going to have a third one, and then we get our follicle recruitment again, and then eventually we have that mature follicle that ovulates. So it is constantly going to be going in waves throughout that cycle in order to keep our follicular waves going. Okay, we're going to kind of skip one and just kind of keep it in terms of how we learned. So LH is our luteinizing hormone. So again, luteinizing hormone, let's see. Sometimes I even get these confused, but it's okay. So luteinizing hormone, again, is coming from our anterior pituitary, targeting the ovary, and it's going to stimulate ovulation. So ovulation only occurs once in the cycle. So we're only going to need that hormone at one specific time. But again, since FSH and LH function together, it's always going to be around. So if we take a look at our squiggly red line, that is our LH. So it's substantially, it's not super substantial, but it's there. So it's going to kind of increase, decrease, all the way up until right before ovulation. So once that luteinizing hormone spikes, our mature follicle is there and it causes ovulation. Once that ovulation occurs, we no longer need LH, so it goes back down. Okay, and then estradiol, or our estrogen, is going to be our green line. So again, we're only going to need all of that estrogen, and it's really going to show up at the time of our standing heat, so right before our ovulation as well. So again, it's going to kind of function with those follicular waves too, because it thinks, okay, we're going to get a follicle to ovulate, but nope, they're going to die off. Maybe they're going to ovulate again, they're going to die off. But then finally, whenever we have that third follicular wave, our estrogen is going to continually increase, and then she's going to ovulate, and then once she's ovulated, estrogen is going to go back down. So I really like this graph again because you can kind of see all together, see how everything functions, and it makes a little bit more sense rather than me just telling you all about the hormones. Okay. All right. So now that we kind of know all the players in the game, let's talk about why sometimes this may not work perfectly. So reproductive loss is very real in our cow herds, very real in our heifers. So let's get into it. So why in the world would she ever lose a calf or may not even be bred? It can be difficult to pinpoint the exact cause, especially when I'm invited out to a farm and I have this dead cow or dead calf, and they're like, why did this happen? Why did she abort? It's hard to really, you can't just look at it and immediately know. So it can be some negative impacts or a culmination of those that causes that loss. But really, when you break it down, the main culprits are either some type of infectious disease, genetic malfunctions, and decreased or poor nutrition. So again, back to that nutrition thing, it is always a factor in some way, shape, or form, either positive or negative. Okay, so let's talk about some of our infectious diseases. Again, we're just going to keep this pretty base level, but you can go as deep as you want to into some of these topics. So some of our infectious causes, they can be bacteria, it can be mold, viruses. They can affect that fetus or our reproductive tissue mainly through blood transfer. And then venereal diseases also fall into this category and are transmitted by that natural mating. So one or two examples could be trick and brucellosis. So if you've ever had a bull tested for those, that is why, because it is a disease that can cause reproductive loss in the cow. So when we think about calves being aborted, that's usually caused by an infection, and it can affect a single individual cow, or sometimes it can be bad enough that it affects an entire herd. So if you have, for example, a bull that has trick, he breeds all the cows in your herd, all of those cows abort, most likely it's going to be that bull instead of just a random disease. So this is one reason that a lot of people like AI, because it does take those venereal diseases kind of out of the equation. Okay. And then more causes that can cause your reproductive loss. This list kind of gets a little bit more numerous. These are also harder to really track down. So remember, our infectious causes, we usually can test for those and see what they were, but our non-infectious usually takes an autopsy by a very good vet to figure out exactly what the deal was. So some examples of non-infectious causes can be incomplete gene transfer. So our recessive genes or something just didn't form right in the very beginning can cause reproductive loss. Nutritional toxins, so if we think about high nitrates or prussic acid in our forages, those can also be culprits. Hormone imbalance of that female. Injury to that female, so if for whatever reason she breaks a leg she's probably going to be in so much stress that fetus gets aborted. Another cause can be poor nutrition. So again, nutrition is always going to show up in some shape or form. If she is bred during the heat of summer, heat stress can be a cause of abortion, as well as dystocia. So if she carries a calf full term, but then has trouble birthing that calf, that still is considered a cause or reproductive loss. Okay, how can we mitigate loss? So if we think about it, even though that cow has to technically be bred and give birth to a calf in order to start producing milk, that calf is still a source of income in some way, shape, or form. Either it's sold or it's retained in the herd to become a milking animal as well. So we want to minimize our loss as much as we possibly can. So how do we do it? One way is just keep detailed records. And this may not seem like a big fix all, but you can definitely see year to date some of the trends in your herd. So if you have a cow who is continually having dystocia issues, keep a record of that and see maybe why or what is changing. Another way to mitigate your loss is stay up to date on your vaccine protocols. So if we think back to those infectious diseases, a lot of those can be mitigated by vaccinating your herd. Another one, again, you're going to grow so tired of me saying this, but appropriate nutrition. Just keeping that energy balance up and giving her everything that she needs to be on a good nutritional plane can mitigate a lot of your reproductive loss. So timely herd vet checks are important as well. Sometimes they can see something starting or an infection in your herd, maybe before you pick up on it. Another way to mitigate loss is facilities. So when I think about facilities, I think about that calf care aspect. So once that calf is born, if it's in the dead of winter, you should probably get them inside and keep them nice, warm, and toasty so they're not out in the cold. And then finally, be willing to accept and learn from past mistakes. So it does take a little bit of self-humbling to be able to do this. But if you can realize that, hey, maybe this practice didn't really work great for me in the past, I should probably change it. A lot of that can also mitigate your loss. Okay, I promise I will wrap it up soon, guys. I know you have an afternoon to get back to, but we are almost done. So gestation, keeping it super simple. So gestation, or the time frame that a cow is considered bred or pregnant, is usually 283 days. Of course, that varies. It can vary between 279 and 292 days. And that is impacted by maybe the breed of your cow, the sex of the calf, nutrition again, and disease. And then one more important thing to remember for gestation is most of that fetal growth is actually going to occur in the last 3 months of gestation. So it is important, again, make sure she is having adequate nutrition, especially in those last 3 months when that calf is really pulling all of those stores from her body. Okay, and then parturition, so actually having the calf. So parturition is the process of calving, but it actually can be divided into 3 progressive stages. So why is this important to us? Especially if you're not one to be out there pulling calves and you want her to go lay down and have that calf on her own, it can be helpful to know exactly what's going on and maybe when you should intervene. So let's talk about it. So parturition occurs in 3 stages. So let's start at stage 1. Stage 1 is when our uterine contractions are going to start. So our cervix is also going to dilate, and that fetus starts to pass out of the uterus and into the vagina. So stage 1 can last up to 24 hours, but usually that 1 to 4 hour mark is normal. Okay. So once she starts those uterine contractions, maybe 4 hours pass, we are now moving into stage 2. So stage 2 is when those abdominal contractions start. So you really start seeing her stomach area really squeeze and then contract. So in stage 2, that fetus is going to completely exit the uterus, move through that vaginal canal, and then be expelled through the vulva. So this is the actual stage of giving birth. So birth from beginning to end will occur usually within 1 to 4 hours. Our mature cows who've been there, done that, they can usually do it in under 3. However, if they don't make any progress or they look kind of stuck within that, it goes over that 4-hour mark, that's when you should probably be getting on the phone with your vet and asking for some help. So once that calf is out, once it's on the ground, we move into stage 3 partition. So stage 3 is the passage of those fetal membranes. So remember our placenta and our uterine involution starts. So once the placenta is out, she's going to automatically start healing up her uterus. So membrane should be completely expelled out within 12 hours of that calf being on the ground. Okay. All right, any questions about gestation or parturition? Okay. So we kind of remember dystocia. I think I brought it up a little bit earlier when we were talking about reproductive loss, but this is something that can happen during parturition or during that birth event. So dystocia is actually when the labor process is obstructed by the fetus being stuck in a position or a way where it cannot progress through the birth canal to be birthed. So I really like this picture because you can see a lot of different ways that calf can be in a dystocia form. So if we look on the left, this is our normal calving position. So essentially they should look like an Olympic swimmer coming off of a diving board is the simplest way that I can describe that. Anything other than that position is going to be considered dystocia. So they could be upside down, they could be backwards, their head cannot be out, they could have just their back legs out. So any one of these forms can interrupt that normal process of parturition. So this is really common in our first calf heifers, mainly because they are going to be a smaller frame, but it can also be decreased through our selection decisions. So if we pick a bull that has lower birth weight calves, that decreases our chance for dystocia. So again, this is one way where I would call our vet and be like, hey, she's not progressing, and they can usually get in there and tell, okay, your calf is situating the wrong way, and they can either flip it or help that cow progress. So, okay, any questions about dystocia? Kind of broad, kind of vast, but important to know about, especially if you're going to have your own cows. Okay, then if you are interested in doing artificial insemination, I have put together a kind of quick supply list just to run through very briefly. So again, if you have questions about any of this, I was just trying to give you all the basic info that you need, but there's a lot more that can go into it. Great, so our basic supply list is to get you up and going. So you are going to need a semen tank. You're going to actually need those straws of semen that are stored in the tank that you're going to breed with. Your artificial insemination gun, one that you're actually going to use to deposit that semen. Sheaths, which is essentially a protector that goes on the outside of your gun. A thaw bath unit to thaw your frozen straws of semen. Lube, of course. Tweezers, a straw cutter, gloves and paper towels. Remember our hormones that we talked about, and I gave you all those trade names. Those are all injectable hormones that you will need to do your AI protocols with. And then in parentheses, I also have VCPR. So that is your vet-client-patient relationship. So for all of these hormones, they have to be ordered or prescribed to you by a veterinarian. So making sure that you have a good working relationship with them can make things go a lot easier. And then lastly, a CEDAR or CEDAR application. So remember our CEDAR was that synthetic form of progesterone. Those are pretty much always needed in your protocols. However, if you don't want to keep up with all of these things, a way around that is to have a good AI technician. You can call them, you can say, I want these cows bred, and they will do everything for you. It does come with a price, but they will do it start to finish. They'll do your protocols, they'll AI your cows, and you are done. Or if you want to learn how to do this, we actually offer an AI school in fall and spring. We just finished up our fall one. But if you would like to be put on our waiting or our notification list for our next one coming up in spring, please let me know. Those are pretty much always out at the Joplin Regional Stockyards, and I love them. They are my favorite program of the year. So, shameless plug, come to AI school. Okay. And then lastly, let's talk just a little bit about facilities, and I will let you go for the day. So facilities can make a world of difference when it comes to your comfortability of handling, working your cattle, and getting things bred. So when we think about our facilities for breeding, one of our most common ones are just a working chute with a palpation cage. So you may already have a chute at home. Just add on a little cage to the back of it, and I'll show you a picture, and that helps a ton. You can use just straight headlocks. So if you have lots of dairy ladies that are used to being handled, used to being moved, used to being fed in a headlock, those work very well. We also have things called a breeding box, which are kind of little portable trailers that you can rent. And all you do is that you funnel cows into them, they stand there, you breed, and then they walk on out. And then if you have been on a bigger dairy, a lot of them have palpation rails, which essentially they just line up in kind of like a rail box, and they're all diagonal, and you can breed that way. Okay, so let's take a look at some pictures. Of course, on our left, we have our chute, and then this open box back here, that is our palpation cage. In the middle, we just have some headlocks. And then on the right, this is our palpation rail. So you can see there's no dividers in there. Our cows just walk in nice and quietly, stand diagonal. They are all bred, and our AI tech will usually just go right down the line, breed all the ladies, and then they are free to go. So just make sure whatever facilities you have are safe for handling your cows, safe for breeding. Make sure you're not going to get into a compromised position, and make sure that cow is safe too. All right, y'all, you made it through almost the entire presentation. Here's actually some pictures of the breeding box. So just a little trailer, and you can walk cows in, they can be bred, they can walk out. Okay, now you have made it to the end of the presentation. So thank you guys for sticking around. Again, here is all of my contact information. I know we went through a lot of this pretty fast. It's pretty heavy hitting topics that can be a little bit confusing. So if you need some more clarification, you have more questions, you want to talk more about something, please just give me a call, send me an email, and I will get back to you. But I love cattle reproduction. It's just my jam. So please feel free to reach out. Okay. All right. So our next session is actually going to be in November as well. It's going to be on Monday the 18th. And this will be about all things milking. So talking about milk safety, milk quality, anything and everything. All right, guys. So I will send out this recording as well as an evaluation to complete about this program. Otherwise, I will see you not next Monday, but the next on the 18th at 12 o'clock. Thank you, guys.